Okay.
Yep, that's
I
it.
think we're good to go.
Yep. Yeah.
All right. So today I'm going to be talking about web app testing simplified. My name's Ian Briley. I've been a tester for about 5 years. About 2 years of that I've been at Red Siege, and then I would say my total tech background has been about 15 years. And I'm joined here today with Justin Palk.
Hey, I'm a senior security consultant here at Red Siege. I've been doing IT for 16, 17 years at this point, full-time pen test for a little more than 2, but I was doing some web app stuff, on the side for a few years before that. So,
Perfect. So I just want to talk really quickly about what created this talk. I'm in the process right now of learning like Windows, Azure, AWS stuff specifically, and I feel a little overwhelmed by doing learning all that stuff. And so normally what I do is I reach out to people that are more senior than me. I'm like, hey, how did you learn this? How did you approach this? Uh, what did you go through while learning this? And since I do a lot of web app testing specifically, I try to relate it back to stuff I already know. And time again, I'm hearing from new people and people that have been kind of like out of the web app game. Hey, don't feel overwhelmed because web apps are way more complicated than what you're doing in Azure or AWS, which to me kind of blows my mind. And of course, the thing that you're used to doing daily, you're not going to find that nearly as hard as something new. And as I started asking people, okay, well, what do you find hard about web apps? What do you find about, X, Y, and Z? It wasn't the attacks. It wasn't, it wasn't the attacks, the tools. It seemed to be that they just felt overwhelmed by the amount of stuff that you potentially have to look at during a web app test. And so I kind of want to focus in that and then talk more about like the attitude or the method that you should approach a web app test and not specifically the tools. So the goal ultimately, and I'm going to use a lot of really weird analogies. I love analogies, so buckle up. If you've ever seen the YouTube series, they're popular on Chinese YouTube. They're called Aegon and Poker Face Man. The whole shtick with their YouTube channel or the Chinese YouTube channel is that Aegon performs magic tricks, and then the Poker Face Man is usually lurking in the background. And after Aegon finishes his magic trick, the Poker Face Man will ruin the magic trick. He'll either push him out of the way or he'll show how the trick is done. And the cool analogy with this that's buried in the center of it is uh, sorry, excuse me. The analogy I'm trying to pull out of this specifically is that with magic tricks, there's one of two things. It boils down to perspective, or it boils down to like tools that you aren't aware of. And with this talk specifically, we're going to focus on changing your perspective for a web app test. So there's two real quick things that I want to talk about with the mindset just to get started. There's two things that you need to keep in mind when you're doing a web app test. The first one is that all web apps is that they are an input-output machine. So you give an input, you'll get an output from the web app. That's all you really need to know. And then the other thing you need to know is that electrons are cheap. So there's no reason for you to not try something as long as it's safe and you're not going to do anything destructive in nature. And as long as you have those two mindsets specifically, you don't need to worry about anything else. You can try a whole bunch of stuff. You can run a whole bunch of different scans. You can run a whole bunch of different iterations of like different variables. You can look at different commands and tools to do the thing that you need to do. But realistically, you just need to know what input you gave it and what output that you're going to receive.
And if I can jump in here for a second, Ian, and sort of linking this back to where you started about, people saying, oh my God, web apps are so complicated, I can't keep up with it. What Ian just said about it, it's just a simple input-output machine. That basically goes for every web app, no matter how big. I mean, it's possible that you may inject something over here and it comes out way the heck over here, but it's still the same basic process. So yeah, staying focused on that, is definitely a good way to, to begin with any web app. What are you feeding it and what is it giving you back and where is it coming out?
Right. So I really, really like analogies, as I said earlier. So I actually brought a prop today. So hopefully you guys can see this, but this is the best example I have for an input-output machine. So if you've ever gone to a craft store or you've gone to like I live up in Maine, so we have like a Maine knickknack store, you'll get these twisted nails, and the trick of this is that you want to divide them. And a web app is exactly one of these twisted nails. You can look at the nails, You can examine like the structure of it. You can look at how they connect, and you can make determinations from that. The cool thing with this, and this is what I'm talking about when I say it's an input-output machine, you don't need to know the you don't need to know the crude iron content of these nails to solve the puzzle. You don't need to know like how much zinc is used in the galvanization process to coat the nails. You don't need to know any of that stuff. You just need to understand how nail A interacts with nail B. So, for example, typically when you're doing a web app test, what we're looking to do is we're looking to abuse logic. We're looking to see how the logic interacts with each other. And one of the best examples that I have for that, and this is what I typically use to train new people in doing web apps, is your day one, you got a user login, you're looking for user enumeration. So we're looking at this and we're going, okay, well, we got to first find the inputs. And so one of the things that I like to do when I'm doing a web app test is I try to understand like how the user is going to interact with this web app. So if you're holding these nails, for example, you don't like, this feels bad. All right, this is probably not how they want you to interact with nails. So we're going to look for a different set of inputs. So this feels a lot better. So what you can start doing is examining the logic of the web app. So, for example, I can't twist it. If I twist it a certain way, it's a lot harder. It doesn't feel good. But if I do this, oh, this feels a lot better. And now I can pull on it. You can maybe hear the noise. You're getting different noises when you pull on it. And then eventually you just keep on messing with the logic until you can pull them apart into two separate nails. But by examining the web app, for example, I can determine with a form, there's a username and password. So we're going to circle back to that real quick. And this is what I'm talking about. Electrons are cheap. So for example, I can send a whole bunch of requests and not waste any more time. The only thing I'm probably wasting is a few seconds of my life. So when you're doing a web app, once again, you got to find the inputs that you want to use. And then, for example, I'm going to keep this one input the same always. And then this one I'm going to change. So this one will have a bad password. And this one will keep on changing the usernames. So I say, okay, a known bad username. Or here, let's bring this over here. So real quick response, it has a different sound. But if I use a valid username that I know, but an invalid password, it's going to take a little bit longer to go around. And then it's going to give the sound. So from that, you go from quick, it takes a little bit longer, and you get a separate different sound from that. And using that alone, you're getting two falses from a statement. But more specifically, we can tell slight differences from those false statements to understand the process or the logic on the back end that the web app is using. So it takes longer. So the username's good, but then it's like hashing the password. It's sending it to the back end. It's reviewing it, and then it's rejecting it. So that could be a timing thing, or you could get like a different error. That produced a much different sound than the immediate bad username.
And yeah, once you've been doing web apps for a while, you will, you're not literally going to get a sound, but you will get a feel of, okay, this seems to be flowing right there. This is going pretty clean. I don't feel like there's anything, here, but this field over here, I can see where it's coming back. I can, I've got a feeling there's going to be something in here. Maybe they're not sanitizing it right. Maybe it's getting injected and it's going to pop up somewhere else, but you can get a sense for what are the parameters you really want to poke at. But again, it's still, just provide an input and watching for output.
Right. And like with the nail example before, I just kept one input the same and I just kept on changing the output or kept on changing the other input, and I just examined the output. So, and that is a great example of electrons are cheap. That took me like 2 seconds to just kind of like review the process and review the logic that's probably happening in the background and make determinations from that. For me to solve this nail process problem, I didn't need to know the stack. I didn't need to know the technology. I didn't need to have like this deep understanding of WebSockets. That stuff helps. It 100% helps. But if you're a new person and you're just diving into web apps, like just watching how the web app reacts to what you're doing is key here. Go ahead, Justin.
I was just going to say, so in a slightly more complicated example, how do you decide, what you're going to invest? I mean, electrons are cheap, but most of our tests are time boxed.
Okay.
So where do you decide, or how do you decide, what you're going to spend more time on, or what looks potentially more interesting for doing this sort of input output testing?
So I have another crazy analogy that I like to use. I call it white whale hunting versus gray whale hunting. So let's take an example. You're querying user data from a GUID, right? And that GUID is generated, it's 16 characters, choose 255. Like, it's, unless I am some elite like crypto hacker person, it's not gonna be worth my time trying to either figure out how the GUID's generated or iterate through every GUID ever possible, and that is like an example of like a white whale. Like, it's cool if you're able to figure that out, but if you miss the overall thing where it's like, hey, just using that GUID, there's no restrictions to like what users' data you can enumerate, that's worth like 50 gray whales compared to that one white whale. And so typically what I try to do is I'll look at the intent of the user application and then what the customer wants or what the client wants, and try to find like plausible, normal things that you could abuse to have a greater gain. Breaking the GUID, figuring out how that's generated, that's cool, but that isn't really nearly as important as the, hey, let's see if we can just find GUIDs and then reuse those values elsewhere in the application to pull down data that we're not supposed to. Recently, and I'm pulling this from memory, so don't quote me on this, but OWASP has moved like indirect object references, accessing stuff that you're not supposed to, logical errors, year after year, those have just jumped up the list. Whereas, your more traditional like SQL injections and, XSS stuff, like that's falling lower and lower on the list. And so, you gotta test where the code is, essentially.
Makes sense.
So I have another kind of a cool example of this, and I don't want to drag this out too long, but MFA is a good example of this. Bypassing MFA, it happens. I found it like on 3 or 4 tests so far. And what I did was I just sat back and I went, okay, electrons are cheap and it has to get data from me somehow, and it has to give me data back. And so I found, for example, in one MFA thing, I was like, oh, I wonder if I can just blast the code over and over again, and does it actually ever time out? And so, I kept the user login the same, and then the second it got to that portion of like, hey, enter your 2-factor authentication code, I was like, okay, well, let's just blast all these wrong codes and then one right code. And kind of like with the nails again, I kept on getting different sounds. I kept on getting the same sound over and over again, but eventually it unlocked and it opened up for me. I went, oh, this doesn't actually check to see if there's like a rate limiting thing involved to stop me from spraying for password codes, especially if it's like, 6 digits and you have like 10 minutes to do that. That's not too hard, or that's not too out of scope to spray through all those numbers specifically.
Yeah, I found one like that it was password resets. They had a 24-hour window on a password reset email, so I just blasted through 10 million password reset email codes and eventually found the one that hit.
Mm-hmm.
But getting to your point about the OWASP, yeah, because like the frameworks are getting a lot better at protecting people from injection attacks. But the sort of errors you're describing, those are ones that there's not going to be a framework for. It's, the logic of the application. The developer had to make a decision about, how are we going to check to see whether someone has access to this thing? And they screwed it up. They overlooked something. They put, some sort of loose matching as opposed to strict matching or something. And now, Bob can get at Eve's data or something.
Right. And, like when you're looking for logic errors, like, yeah, it helps if you have an understanding of coding. It helps if you understand like the stack or the framework that's being used in place. But ultimately, you can go into the application just looking for these logical errors and like, how they process permissions, for example. And you can still find that, and it's still a valid gray whale finding. It's still something that's worth going after. Another real quick example I have is, I just sat there and I reviewed the traffic for one web app, and I realized that as long as you sent 2 bits of data that you could just guess, you didn't need to know a password or anything, it would return a token that I could use and abuse. I didn't need to know all the intricacies of JWTs. I didn't need to know all the background information of how it's validating stuff in the background. I simply just watched how it interacted with my data and the data it gave back, and I went, okay, well, let's try this. This is non-destructive. Let's try this. So we're at the 25-minute mark right now. So
15.
the big oh, we're at the 15. Wow. Okay.
25 since we started the pre-show banter.
Awesome. So like some of the things I just really want to focus on is that, it's an input-output machine. And, like spoiler alert, all computers are input-output machines. But specifically with web apps, you're just so confined to just that one web app that you really don't have to worry about, how AD works or how AD interacts with, these permission levels on these folders on this share. You can just solely focus on that. And the fact that a lot of web apps, because they're out on the web, they're kind of built to be a little tougher. So, you can just beat on them for hours. So there's no reason for you to not try something as long as it won't destroy something in the process. The other thing, and I've said this before, is realistically your testing logic. If ever you're on a report or you get a report back and you get something it looks like a software inventory, like wrong. All right, I'm just going to say that's wrong. We'll include those findings, but I spend maybe 5 minutes on that. I'll go, okay, you have these vulnerable software libraries. I tried X, Y, and Z to try to, exploit them. It didn't work, but I'm assuming that your developers are smarter than me because, you know your own baby best. And I'll include that, but I'm not going to try to like document every little, I'm not going to do a software inventory for people because that's just not what we're looking for when we're doing a web app test, like not to go back to the nails again, but, for a developer, unless there's something a very, very specific attack where I'm attacking like a supply chain and I am going after the zinc contents of, the galvanization process of that. It's not useful for clients to know that amount of details. And then once again, you're hunting white whales at that point, and you're missing the 50 gray whales that are swimming past you all around you. So for that specifically, we're looking at logic. We're looking at, okay, does this logic make sense? Does this actually protect you from something? Recently, I was doing a web app for a healthcare system. And, from my background, I worked at a hospital and I understood that, typically you don't want your nurses to be able to snoop on everybody. HIPAA violations are a huge, huge deal. So, our policy was, okay, well, you restrict nurses who they can access, and that gets complicated with like per diems and, people that travel to different hospitals. But realistically, the goal is to restrict access. And just knowing that, I was on a web app and I was looking at, I saw that I could pull patient data just by iterating through a number. And I went, oh, geez, I wonder if I just try a different patient number. And, looking at the logic, I could see like you have access to this patient, you don't have access to this patient, and this patient doesn't exist. I went, okay, well, let's see what else I can do. And by pairing like 2 or 3 different APIs together, I was able to figure out like, oh, hey, I can't get all the information in API A, but by the time I get enough information from API A to B and then B to C, I have a pretty much a complete picture of that patient's information. And that's a huge, huge deal. Like you don't want your nurses, a nurse gets popped, it happens, and you don't want them to be able to just pull infinite data from every patient in your database. Like that's just not desirable. But, once again, I didn't going into this, because we only get like maybe a week to be with your web apps, 2 weeks for like a really good test, unless you have like really good documentation and I have easy access to the devs to ask questions and you provide code to me. I can only go off the knowledge I have pre-existing for whatever framework you might be using. And more specifically, I can only analyze the logic that I'm seeing from the web app itself.
Yeah. And to that point, I mean, unless I see a web app that is visibly using something, really old PHP 7 or something like that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time researching the technology. I'm going to spend more time up front just, playing around with the application, getting a feel for how it works and what it does. Unless I've got something that specifically clues me in, there might be a particular, technology stack vulnerability in play. I don't spend a lot of time on that, because there's too many of them. A lot of them end up being, too much of an edge case. This is a vulnerability. If they've used this particular, JavaScript function out of like 2000 in this library, you might be able to do something with it.
Yeah, like I think since I've been a tester too, I have had like that, like OSCP, esque, like you find a vulnerable library and then you find the vulnerable function kind of deal. I have found that maybe twice. Most of the other stuff, and a scanner would have found that like almost instantaneously. Whereas like a lot of like and not to like humble brag or anything, but the stuff that clients seem to really appreciate was stuff me like just walking through the application and seeing how it works, understanding like how the application's handling authentication, or how it's handling like, file uploads, for example. I think we had a question.
So there's a question. Mike G in the Discord was asking, how much of your testing time is spent on methodology and checklists? How much is just experience and hunches? And how much is just throwing tools and scanners at it?
So I'm going to use another really, really weird analogy. I've always considered web apps to be more like jazz music, where it's a little bit more like it's a little bit more free structure. You're not listening to a song that has a defined like start, middle, and end. So typically what I'll do is I'll spend maybe an hour or two just running through the basic checklist, because once again, we're hunting for gray whales, not that white whale. And then based off of like, what the scans show me, the normal things that I look for, mapping out the parameters, understanding what libraries are connecting to what, or how they're trading data back and forth. From there, I can start developing like better ideas to go after edge cases, excuse me. So realistically, I'd say like, your standard checklist, probably 4 hours, maybe up to 8 hours, depending on like the size of the app. And then from there, based on what I see from the results of that, or if I see like a parameter, I have a little cheat sheet that I keep up, like client notes essentially in a notepad on my Kali VM. And I'll actually copy and paste like parameters or URLs I found interesting, or post requests I found interesting, to circle back and then do more specific like experimentation. And that's more of like an organization thing. Like the other big, bonus tip for doing web apps is you need to be organized, because of that free form approach to web apps.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. Yeah, 4 or 5 hours on the checklist and sort of basic, security hygiene of the web app stuff. A bit of time on the scanning, and don't get me wrong, the scanners find things sometimes.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to spend a couple of 3 days trying to get the scan set up working correctly, because the app has some weird way it's handling authentication and session management. I'll spend some time on it, and then it's moving on to just learning how the app works, and looking for things that feel like they've got some potential in them. And you always want to make sure. So and this is another kind of checklist. You always want to make sure you hit the key functionality. You check your login stuff. Make sure that when you log out properly, your session gets cleared. Password changes. And then it's move on to the core functionality of the app, whatever it happens to be, for that client.
Like when I used to train new web app testers, one of the things I would tell them, other than the first two things I already told you, like, it's an input output machine. Electrons are cheap. The other big thing is that scanners are really bad at analyzing logic. They're great for doing, the software inventory. They're great for, comparing, you're using JavaScript jQuery, 3.3.7, I think is the one that has that really bad XSS in it. Don't quote me on that, but it's one of those. They're really, really great for doing that. And it frees up a tester from having to manually comb through every JavaScript library. You're looking for the comments. So it says, oh, this is JavaScript jQuery 3.3.7. It saves you a lot of time, but man, they are like, all the logic stuff that I have found solely by just watching the app work, just walking through the application process and understanding how it works. Whereas the scanner would totally miss stuff like that, like just like stuff that's like super, super easy. Once again, you don't need to know anything really in depth, and it would still miss that. So yeah, I just run through the checklist. I run through the scans just to get a good understanding, like a lay of the land, and then I move on.
Yeah. And one other thing in terms of, developing those hunches and what it is, once you find a particular type of vulnerability, particularly a logic vulnerability somewhere, take that same one and see if you can apply it in other fields, other parameters, because one of two things is going to happen. Either the developer just screwed up and, keyed in something wrong in that one spot, or it's a issue with how they think about doing their development, and they're going to keep repeating that same pattern again. It's very uncommon to have it in the middle, where it's in some places, it's in a few places, but not all of them. It's usually it's either in one or it's in a bunch.
Yeah. I mean, and like, even once again, this isn't really useful to new testers because you don't have that like backlog of information developed yet. But, if I'm doing a test and they're like, oh, we handle everything with jQuery or JavaScript, I go, okay. So that probably what that means is that you're handling a lot of security controls with client-side controls, and you're not actually doing any validation on the back end. And so, the second I see that they only use jQuery for everything, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to be doing a lot of like client-side bypassing, client-side controls, bypassing those controls specifically. Same thing. One time. And I've always made the joke, I'm surprised more pen testers aren't degenerate gamblers, because we find one thing that works one time and then we're going to try it forever and ever. So one of the things I found 3-4 years ago was I realized, oh, hey, this web app, when you're registering an account, takes anything. You can put anything into the username, it'll accept it and it will reflect it back. And so I was like, okay, well, let's just try using a link and see if it injects the link into the, hey, welcome to, X, Y, and Z service email. And it worked that one time. And I still find it to this day, like, time and time again. And that is like an awesome way to fish people. If you're trying to like get credentials or something, you're like, oh, hey, a new account's been registered. Go ahead and log into, this malicious URL. And, I don't need to find hosting. I don't need to season the domain. I can just use your application that has a pretty easy logic error and start phishing people with your valid domain.
All right. Got some more comments over here. No, just prompting for questions. All right. Guess, does anyone else have any questions?
It doesn't appear so. Which, thank you for coming to this talk. Real quick again, if you're brand new or you're coming back to web apps, just they're way more simple than what people are making out to. Like, they're input output machines, and you don't need to know every little thing about the framework. You just need to understand what the output is. And the most expensive thing that you're spending during the testing time is just your own time. So be smart, hunt for those gray whales, avoid the white whales. Other than that,
sounds good.
Thanks for coming out, everybody. You have a good one.
Thanks all. Have a good afternoon.